I always say when I talk at schools and conferences, inclusion is not something we do, it's who we are.
I see a time, hopefully, where the technology is able to help meet the needs of students with differing learning needs. The fact that, as you know, GEMS as a school approach are going way beyond the statutory requirements when it comes to inclusion, and you're spearheading that, I think it's an example that other schools could pick up from. Today I'm thrilled to be here with Berna Bouwer, the Corporate Head of Inclusion at GEMS Education. I am thrilled to follow my conversations with Dr. Martin Bloomfield and Sandra Tibbles, now with a conversation with Berna, who oversees inclusion across all the GEMS schools. And this is such an important topic, and I'm really excited to be talking to Berna about this topic, which is actually very important to me as a practitioner. So Berna, can I ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your journey and how did you come to be the Corporate Head of Inclusion at GEMS?
Thank you so much for having me, Aslam. I think you're right. Inclusion and the education piece is so important, and it does not get enough airtime. So I'm really, really blessed and honored to be on your podcast. My journey is a strange one. I'm South African born, grew up in South Africa, but was undiagnosed with ADHD until I was about 22 years old. And it's a tricky journey because in the 1970s, there wasn't really any spotlight on ADHD or neurodiversity, especially under girls. And I went to university to study teaching, and one of my professors actually said, "Berna, I think you have ADHD," which was an unknown thing in South Africa. I was diagnosed and then went through the stages. And that actually sparked my interest in special needs education, because if I could prevent any child to go through 8 hours a day of schooling where you don't feel good enough for 13 years of your life, then that's what my life mission would be. And I was incredibly blessed along the way to work in special needs schools in South Africa. I'm a teacher of mathematics and English as a second language, and then qualify as an educational psychologist. And that also gave me the opportunity to work in a therapeutic setting. So I was lucky to have both sides. I had the teaching side as well as the therapeutic side. And then in 2009, my husband got the opportunity, also South African, to be placed in the Middle East. And I came over with two young boys. And my youngest, at that stage 3, when he was born prematurely with cerebral palsy, which just gave me another route into the special needs arena. And when I came to the UAE, we couldn't find schools for both the boys because everybody wanted my eldest, who was a beautifully verbal, bright young boy, but nobody really wanted to give my youngest the space because of his cerebral palsy diagnosis. And at that stage, I was working at the Center for Autism because in education psychology, autism is my speciality. And I went to the KHDA, our regulatory body, and they then said, or the guy I met there, Mr. Hassan Aboud, said, "Berna, you're a teacher, go teach. Then they have to take your children." So I then made my way back into teaching and was offered the role at a GEM school to be head of inclusion. And then very quickly, because I'm so passionate about the inclusion piece, worked with the ministries and the regulatory bodies on directing inclusion. Then in 2016, I went to the UK and was Director of Inclusion or Special Needs in the UK for GEMS Education there, and also taught in some schools there. And in January 2024 was asked to come back to the UAE for GEMS again. So been working for GEMS for 13 years. It's almost the equivalent of starting in the mailroom and working your way up. And I am now the corporate head of inclusion, looking after about 48 schools in the UAE and Qatar, and around about 170,000 students on our books.
That is so inspiring, Berna. Especially, I find it quite touching that your experiences led you down that path. And you saw there was a need. And I am very, very, very certain. I'm quite sure that when you were at the UAE, when you were working with the ministries, you changed attitudes. I'm absolutely certain of that because when I came here to Qatar 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, attitudes were very different. you face some resistance, and I can understand that as well because, as a parent, I become a parent now. As a parent, if I was called into the school and I was told your child has such and such, it would be, your head would spin and you'd think, oh my goodness, what do I do? You feel, Martin and I talked about how the parents feel as helpless as the children do, and then the children obviously learned helplessness because they're told you can't do this and you can't do that. But that helplessness starts first with the parents, and over time those attitudes have changed now. Now people are more open to having those discussions, and I'm quite certain that's because of the wonderful work that inclusion teachers have done in Qatar. But I think you are being out in the Middle East. I'm in the UAE. I'm certain that you change attitudes, and that's why you were called back because of the impact that you had because of your passion.
Thank you. I think part of it is because inclusion is such a personal piece to me. I always say when I talk at schools and conferences, inclusion is not something we do; it's who we are. It is in the fabric of everything that we think. And you know what? As a parent who's also lived that journey with a child who's now at university in the UK, lots and lots of OT and lots of therapies to get him there. But as a parent, I also understand, and I can say to a parent, like I can say to the ministries, I get it. I've been where you are now because there's a grieving process that goes with it. But part of the issue we have is, and this is why I'm so passionate about this GEMS piece as well, is when we upskill our parents and we upskill our teachers and we upskill our regulatory bodies and we upskill our leaders, everybody gets upskilled. And what happens is that high expectation for every child, whether there's a learning need or a physical need or not, is we expect that you can do. I think one of the best things that the UAE has actually done in the past 15 years since I came, nothing to do with me, but just the development of it, is where they believe that every child has a space, every child has a place, and people of determination and students of determination in GEMS, but also in other schools, have to have the best opportunity to have a future. It's not just about access to schooling. It's not just about getting through the door. It's about what do we do when we get there. So I absolutely love that piece as well.
Well, one thing I love about GEMS and the approach that GEMS takes towards inclusion is that it puts that at the center of it, inclusion. It's not exclusion. It's not, and certain schools take a different approach, but at GEMS, we have a policy where it's inclusion. Those students with special needs, as different as they may be, they're part of the educational process. They're not taken outside the classroom. The support occurs in the classroom. And that's brilliant because if a child is taken out of a lesson, they're made to feel different and they're shown to be different. Whereas if they're getting the support in the classroom, then that TA has that flexibility to float around, support other students, and suddenly that child doesn't feel targeted, and it's inclusion with a focus on inclusivity and moving away from the more dated attitudes of exclusion and taking them out of the classroom. And that's one thing I love about the way that GEMS approaches inclusion.
The thing is when you look at universal design for learning, which is a hugely celebrated model in inclusion, when we go to the least restrictive environment, the idea is that belonging and relationship happens first. Learning will come. Learning will always come. Whatever that learning looks like. But when I'm part of a community and I feel like I belong and I feel like I'm part of something bigger and I feel like I have a purpose, suddenly my self-image change. And there's a guy, Leo Thompson, who works very hard on self-concept and those things with students of determination or students with special needs. And one of the basic things that he says is when a child thinks they can, they will work at it. So that growth mindset is only starting once the child thinks they can. And that starts by the teacher thinking the child can and giving the child the message that you should be here. I think you can do it. And you're absolutely right. We went from a segregation model to an exclusion, segregation, integration to inclusion. And that's hopefully where we are now.
Yeah, Leo's a good friend of mine. He's been at my house actually. Yeah, we had a podcast together, and Leo, he just published something today actually on LinkedIn. He talked about how can we determine a child's full potential. We can't. We can guess, but ultimately we're not really going to know when with these, meters and systems that we keep changing. We can't determine a child's full potential. What we can do is, like you say, empower them, and tell them that you can do this. And more often than not, children will, and I've seen it with my own students. They will surpass their targets. They'll surpass the expectations. They'll surpass all expectations, and that's brilliant to see. And it only happens if you create that culture of possibility. You can do that. Who's to say that you can't? And Martin and I, we talk about this learned helplessness. Well, if you keep telling a child you can't do that, then eventually they're going to convince themselves. Whereas if you do the opposite, then eventually you will. A child will beat those expectations and surprise everyone, in a wonderful way.
You're absolutely right. We had a conversation yesterday. I was at one of our schools doing training with the staff, and we were talking about, you can tell a child 200 times, I think you're great, I think you can do this. But when I then take the pair of scissors and I cut for you, my non-verbal communication tells you that I don't believe the words that are coming out of my mouth, and neither should you. So you're absolutely right. It's that whole piece of it's not just what we say, it's by the behavior. So when we say to a child, you belong here, but we teach them outside of the class, they don't belong. And it's that whole piece of what does a child really get from us as teachers, as parents, when we show through our behavior that we don't think they're capable.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and that's so important. Is that non-verbal communication? Those things that we communicate, which often contradict what we say. And children, are wonderful. They pick up on these things. They're like, no, you don't really believe that. If you believe that, you wouldn't have told me. You wouldn't have taken that paper off me and start cutting it out for me, start sticking it in for me. I can do that. You know. So thank you, Berna. I want to now move you on to so your role at GEMS. As the head of corporate head of inclusion, what does your day-to-day role look like, and what are some of the challenges that you face in your? It's quite a unique role, overseeing so many schools.
So I think one of the biggest parts of my job is the strategic management and leadership of inclusion in the group. What does it look like is we have currently in the UAE, in the 7 Emirates, we have schools in 5 of the 7 Emirates. And what makes it tricky is each of the regulatory bodies have slightly different rules. So I always say the Ministry of Education in the UAE, they're absolutely brilliant, but what they are they're a big box. And each of the Emirates are allowed, as long as they stay in the big box, to kind of do what they see fit in their emirate, which is fine, because if you think about it, in Dubai, we have around about 200 nationalities, 190 different languages spoken. You could quite easily have in one school 118 different languages spoken. So the makeup of the population in education is very different from emirate to emirate. But what makes it quite interesting is, for instance, in Abu Dhabi, where we have 8 schools, we have the ADIC, which is the Abu Dhabi Department of Knowledge, and they call students of determination, they call additional learning needs students. And then in a different place, we would have tiers instead of levels. So there's slight differences between the 5 emirates that we work in. So we've got the 27 schools in Dubai, got 8 schools in Abu Dhabi, 6 schools in Sharjah, 1 school in Ras Al Khaimah, and 1 school in Fujairah. And then, of course, the 2 schools in Qatar, and then some schools that we co-manage in Egypt. Now, my day-to-day job is, and I always say that my main purpose in life at the moment is to be there for the heads of inclusion, because if I make sure that they have the support they need and they can do their jobs, then they won't need me. So part of it is reaching out, training, supporting, and giving advice when they reach out to me. Then there's a huge bit of policy development, compliance, audits, those kind of things, making sure that we are exactly in the framework. The next piece is quality of provision. So making sure that not only do our children get school places and they get what the statutory guidance tells us to do. I always say, if you're compliant, you're just compliant. You're not any good at it, you're just compliant. So what does that piece look like? Then I do a bit of work with external agencies, therapeutic settings, in-school services. And then, of course, I do a lot of training for staff and meeting with parents and students. I have the opportunity, sometimes not as much as I'd like, to work with families as well, um, and helping with transition into our schools and those kind of things.
That's so impressive, Berna. And it's such a huge credit to GEMS, first of all, to have so many schools in so many different countries. It's a huge network. And but then obviously equally challenging is managing all of that. So I think you're doing a wonderful job. And the fact that those slight differences between the schools that are, we often think of UAE as one entire body. Well, actually, no, there are differences between, the makeup of the students and even culture as well. There are those differences, and to manage that's a mammoth task. And I absolutely agree, and I think it's brilliant the approach that you take, where it's, well, if you're being compliant, you're only compliant. I spoke recently about safeguarding, and that how our schools all across the world have a responsibility to go beyond the statutory requirements. That's just the baseline. We don't tell our students as young people, well, this is what the bare minimum, do that. No. So the fact that, as GEMS as a school approach are going way beyond the statutory requirements when it comes to inclusion, and you're spearheading that, I think it's an example that other schools could pick up from.
You know what? I think in the end of the day, I always say if we miss one child as a community, we all fail. And what James has actually done, which is quite brilliant, is they've brought in a team, a person for gifted and talented, a person for well-being, a person for safeguarding, a person for multilingualism or EAL, and then myself for inclusion. And as a team, we work so well off each other, because you might have a school that's really strong in inclusion but struggling with multilingualism or with gifted and talented approaches. So as a team, it also helps that I have four other people that I can bounce ideas off, that I can say, I need a bit of help with this, or who's your contact in that school? And it also changes the game for schools, I think.
I can understand why a school would do that, because it's more cost effective, isn't it, to have one person in charge of inclusion at the top and at the bottom, but that doesn't quite work. And I think, like I said, I'll say it again, other schools could learn from the approach GEMS takes. They do invest in their staff, and evidently so. And that shows with the fact that when you're running the inclusion side of the school, the gifted and talented has someone else responsible for it. It does fall under the same umbrella, but if two people are working, that's far better than one.
Absolutely right.
So like I said, I think GEMS are leading by example, and just in our conversation, I know that there's benefit to be had in that, and there's benefit to be had in other schools learning from the approach taken here. And if schools learn from each other and they say, that school's doing that, that's brilliant, we should try that, because Martin and I will talk about how if a school has one issue, another school may have solved it. So learn from example, from other schools by example. And I think other, managers listening to this conversation could hear some of the things we talks about and say, well, we can try that. GEMS are doing it. They're doing it fantastically well. Let's have a go at that.
And the thing is, as I said earlier to you before you recorded the podcast, that in South Africa we have a saying Ubuntu, which is, I am because we are. None of us can do this job on our own. There's not a single one of us that can be a silo teacher. We need each other. We need systems. And the thing is why does everybody have to go through the same pain, learning the same skill, if we can learn from each other? So you're absolutely right. And I think as a community of educators, education is tiny. And it is time that we put down this whole idea of we're competitive in terms of other schools, and how can we help?
I think other managers and even heads of inclusion that may find the role challenging, they may face challenges, try out some of the things that we're talking about here, because there can be no harm from experimenting and saying, we're going to try this for a term, we'll plan, implement, review, and then the reviews, see how did you get on. It can only work if you have that attitude of, we want to improve, then you will improve, even if it's marginal. And it's all about those marginal gains, really.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
GEMS operates globally. How do you navigate the different cultural contexts while implementing strategies across different regions? Are there some aspects of your role which are quite blanket, and are there other parts where you have to take a more nuanced approach?
That's a brilliant question, Aslam. And I think the answer lies in being quiet and listening to people around you. Um, I would never go into a school or into a region and think I know what it's about, because I really don't. So my approach is always, let me hear what you have to say and what you're doing. And you know what? Sometimes what you're doing is great. In terms of the compliance, that is blanket. Now, in Qatar, for instance, we do not have a blanket compliance yet. It's coming out. The inclusion strategy or framework was launched October last year. And a lot of the work that's gone into that was about what do we need to get in place before we can actually launch, which is a great conversation to have, because many countries or many governments actually go with, this is what we're going to do, but we don't really think about what structures need to be in place before we approach that. So I really like that approach from the Qatari government. But I think for me personally is I speak to people and I listen to what they have to say, and that then determines my response. When I work with the lovely ladies in Egypt, we have 4 schools in Egypt, and when I work with a lovely team in Egypt, I always ask them first. I'm always the last one to speak, and tell me what you're doing. How would you approach this? What have you tried? And then we go back to, okay, so the compliance says this, you've done all of this, how can I support? And I think that is basically the only way you can bring real change, because the more you push, the less people want to hear what you have to say.
I think that's really important, and that's such a admirable approach as well. Because quite often when you're going into, you sometimes can go into inspector mode, and oh well, let me, fault finding, and that has have its merits, but I think it's more fruitious to listen and say, okay, from what I've heard, you're getting such and such right, and these are your targets in order to become compliant. And then we'll talk about how to go beyond compliance after we met those standards. And Leo and I, we talked about this idea when he was CIS inspector. He always took an approach of a guide by the side, and this is the end point in which we want to reach. Let's get there together. And it's that conversation. I'm sure the conversations you have, they're brilliant, because they're less angst ridden. It's more, wow, I'm valued, and what we're doing is, such and such has been praised. Brilliant. Okay, now how can we go forward together?
And that's it, because you know what? I've had brilliant leaders in my career who managed me in that way. And again, that's where I've learned that strategy, because it's easy to go in and find fault. It's easy. It's not so easy to be quiet and listen first, because the question I always have in my heart is, what would I have done if I was in your position with what you have in front of you? Would my reaction be the same or different? What is reasonable? And I read a brilliant quote the other day. I'm all about quotes, and I read a brilliant quote the other day that said, an abnormal reaction in an abnormal situation is a normal reaction.
Yeah, because the situation demands it.
Absolutely. So if I don't know the culture, I don't know the situation, I don't know the population, I don't know your kids. So tell me. And only once you've told me what you've tried and where you're at, I can say, okay, well, in my toolbox, I have these things that might be helpful. But if they're not, that's fine too. We'll find something else. And oftentimes, what I find very, very powerful is to say, you know what? I don't have the answer, but I know so and so and so who's done this and this. Let me put you in contact. Because in the end of the day, Aslam, I have to work myself out of a job. We shouldn't need heads of inclusion, because inclusion should just be who we are.
Yeah, and it's like one of those things, isn't it? Inclusion, safeguarding. It's not one person's job; it's everybody's job. If you're in that school, if you have young people in front of you, inclusion is your job as well.
Absolutely right.
And I came across that. The funny thing is, Berna, you said you're from South Africa. My first venture into inclusion, I wasn't even doing my PGCE. I was at university. I was doing a course called SAS. Not the military. It's called a Student Associate Scheme. Yeah, it's called the SAS. So the idea was that I was at second year university. You go into a school and spend 3 weeks there, and it's a vocational course. It's part of your degree, but it gives you a taste of what school life is like. Because I was already had my mindset on becoming a teacher anyway. So I spent 3 weeks in a school in Wembley, and the head of inclusion there, She was from South Africa,
Yeah.
and I saw how passionate she was and how hard she worked in her role. And in my little report I did for my assignment, I said that the inclusion department, I think, here reflects inclusion departments in all schools, which is that they are, really passionate. That was my takeaway. So I think in your role in managing that and making them feel empowered has really, really had significant benefit for the departments that you work with.
One can hope. I hope so.
But then, so I'll now move you on to then challenges and opportunities. So, what are some of the biggest challenges that schools and educational institutions face when it comes to inclusivity? I talked about how 10 years ago in Qatar and in this region, those conversations were faced with some resistance, right? But attitudes have changed now. What are the challenges that you have seen schools face when it comes to inclusion? Not just in this region, but all across the world.
So it's quite interesting. So in South Africa, for instance, the special needs piece looks very, very different. Because in South Africa, there is a lot of mainstream inclusion, but you'll have a class of 44 students and very not a lot of resources, mostly state-funded schools. And so South African teachers just kind of get on with it. We just kind of get on with it. I had a professor who always said, a good teacher can teach with a stick in the sand. And when I started teaching, just before the 2000s, that's how old I am, just before the 2000s, I started teaching in a township school.
What is that? What's a township school?
It's a very, very low income school, an area in South Africa. And the area where I started was in Shoshanguve. So basically, they've got a little shack. It's similar to the slums in India. Same feel to it. And I had 44 students in my class, or children in my class. No textbooks. There wasn't even windows or a glass in the windows in many of the classrooms. And I used to stop at the petrol station and buy the Pretoria News, which was our local newspaper, and that would be my teaching of the day. And not to say that made me a great teacher, it's just as South Africans, we just get on with it. And then we also have a piece of work where it is specialist schools. So there's a school for cerebral palsy, there's a school for autism, there's a school for the blind, there's a school for epilepsy. So very much segregated. And we know that community and the world doesn't really look like that. You don't have job places just for people with cerebral palsy or just
No,
for
you
people.
don't. So that school system doesn't reflect society. Schools are supposed to prepare young people for the society they're going to face later on.
Absolutely right. So when I came to the UAE, very, very different again, where there wasn't really an inclusion. But when we look at the inclusion piece now, culturally speaking, and I think the royal family and the UAE governance has had a lot to do with this. There was a lot of push on actually making the inclusion piece socially acceptable. Now, there's still loads of conversation that goes on about, the normal journey a parent goes through when you find out your child has a learning need. There's a brilliant poem, and after this, please go look it up. It's called Welcome to Holland, and it's about a month's journey when she thinks that she's going to France like all her friends, and then as the plane lands, the pilot says, Welcome to Holland. And the first thought is, I don't want to be in Holland, but my child is different, and my child is Holland, and everybody else's child is Paris. And how you get to accept in the end how you see the beauty of Holland, but that process. So please do look it up. It's called Welcome to Holland. So in the UAE, and I think people sometimes forget that the UAE is 54 years old, only 54 years old. And I think Qatar is a similar age. So if you think about the work that's gone in, the money that's been invested, and the sheer progress in the last 10 years on the inclusion piece, it's remarkable. But we are still struggling with one bit where everything in the UAE that is external services or extra services are parent funded. And unfortunately, what you now sit with is you sit with a system where support depends on income and not on need.
Yeah.
Somewhere we need to try and find a balance. And having a child with special needs is hugely expensive. If you think you pay school fees On top of that, you pay LSA fees. On top of that, you pay therapy fees. On top of that, you have to have external reports. So, in the end of the day, the cost of inclusion is huge for a parent. But when I worked in the UK, interestingly, although there's a lot more social structure to it, um, many of the counties in the UK are out of money.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
The wait time to be diagnosed or to get those services that you deserve or that you need, that you qualify for because of the social system and how it works, 2 years. You wait for a diagnosis at ADHD for 2 years. And in 2 years' time, we lose so much time with our children. There's a brilliant educationist, David Bartram, who says that we have 1 million minutes with children from the age of 3 to the age of 18 in schools. That's how much time children spend in schools. Now, if I lose 2 years of a child's life in terms of therapy and input, of those million minutes, I'm now cutting it down to 11 years instead of 13 years. So each of the areas in the world, if you look at the idea piece in the US, so there's no perfect model at the moment, and unfortunately, I think there's not enough money to invest in the inclusion piece, and I think that's a huge challenge.
I think that's where, yeah, I remember in the UK, it was a very long process to get a child statemented. You know, it was it's like applying for a house from the council. You never hear back from them. But I think that's where technology might come in a little bit. So I recently spoke about how Martin and I started talking about it first, actually, and I looked into it more. There are now AI-assisted apps that can help in some way, because once you have the device, then the device can do the work, because often the money is required of external help to get TAs in and the support in. But if we can do away with that, we are in the 21st century, and if we can try to help enable the young people to use the technology, and if the technology catches up with the needs and the specific needs of the people, then I think that will really help us to go at least towards where we need to be. Because you've got AI text to speech software, AI speech to text software, and they're still you said the UAE was how many years old? This technology is only a couple of years old. It has to catch up. But it's growing exponentially, and I see a time, hopefully, where the technology is able to help meet the needs of students with differing learning needs. That's the day that I hope for, because then the funding won't be the issue that it is right now, and you can have these maybe a robotic teacher assistant, or it could be a piece of hardware that is tailored to and it's a learning computer. It's tailored to the needs of that individual child to help them. That's the day. I don't know when it's going to happen. It might not be in my lifetime, but that's what I hope for. I hope the technology can catch up and provide the support for all of our students with so many different learning needs.
Absolutely agree. And you know what? There's a brilliant saying: "What's good for a student with need is good for everyone."
Yeah. One thing I found which really helps is if we share our shortcomings with the young people, because especially with students who are autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, they're told so many times, oh, you can't do this part, you can't do this, you can't do that, and they're made to feel like, well, they can't do anything, whereas when I talk to my students, I say, I'm great at English, I'm terrible at maths, I'm really bad at it. All of you put together are better than me, okay? And it's my shortcoming. I can't do it. I'm just not my strong subject. And that's refreshing, because they're like, wow, the teacher is not good at something. Yeah, we are all like that. We all have our shortcomings. We all have some special need when it comes to no one's perfect, no one can do everything. And if we share that with children, especially those who are SEND, that will help them to overcome, because it's the mental barriers and obstacles as well that they have to overcome.
You're absolutely right. And you know what? When we show our vulnerabilities, and I think it's also a generational thing, I think our generation is much more able and likely to say, actually, I suck at that too. When I remember when my boys were little, and I love my mother-in-law to bits, but she would always say, you should make your children eat everything. And I'm like, but I don't like everything. Yes, have a go, have a taste, but I'm not going to make you do anything. And I think that's the thing. When we show children that we also struggle and we also have a journey that we, and the other thing is that we are still all learning.
We're all still learning.
We're all still learning. If I get to the technology piece, I mean, you know what happened earlier today, and if I get to the technology piece, I'm a bear of very little brain.
We all have, young people think that adults, we've got it figured out, and I think it's really is our generation is the generation that we're more open to exposing our vulnerabilities, and there was a time when students with needs were told that, well, that's not really a need, it's not really, these words didn't exist, how many years ago.
Just an excuse. Yeah.
Benjamin Zephaniah, I teach one of his texts, and Benjamin Zephaniah says that when he was at school, the great poet Benjamin, he's passed away now, the late Benjamin Zephaniah, he said that he was told he can be good at sports, but he's not going to be, he's not going to amount to anything at school, and he only found out later on that he had a learning need. He wasn't supported at school, and how terrible is that? And looking at the future, Martin and I talked about how the problematic nature of words, maybe in 20, 30 years time, they might find, that generation, they might find problems with our terminology now. They might say, that's very, very backward, isn't it? Why would they say that? But I think if attitudes are positive and we're there to help the young people feel that, like you say, inclusive, they're part of the class, they're part of that community, and they're not made to be felt to be separate, then I think that's a huge step forward for them.
And I think the big thing is if you just look at the conversation that we're having now. So I'm South African, and I often misunderstand things because English is my fourth language. It's not, it's a language that I use because I have to, but I was brought up in Afrikaans. I speak Sepedi and I speak isiZulu, and it's not languages I can use elsewhere but South Africa. But the point I'm trying to make is even in a conversation that we have, words sometimes get confusing because it's not my first language. And even more so when you are neurodiverse, because what happens in your brain is your brain interprets the feeling of the word and not necessarily the word. And when you are neurodiverse, I always say to parents and to teachers, it's not the fact that I'm ADHD and that I can't be in the box that you want me to be in. It's the fact that I have so much anxiety about your response to my failure to be what you want me to be that my frontal lobe shuts down. So even if I know so a child's sitting in the classroom and they know the answers. As a math teacher, I did a lot of work on my children about math anxiety because I know the answer, but I'm so stressed about the situation and about everybody else around me that I can't give you the answer for the best time of my life. Now that situation gets amplified in the exam setting because now I'm not only judged by everybody around me who's still writing and I'm the only one that's not writing. I've got a teacher who's walking around. I've got a clock that's ticking. And I know in the end of the day that if something goes wrong in this exam, it will impact my future. And how unfair is that? When you are 15, 16 years old, how unfair is that? And that's why, as you say, we need to think differently about how we do this because technically speaking, it's bad for all children. The stress we put children under is bad for all children. And that's why if I say to children, you know what, I struggle to read, or, you saying I'm not great at maths, it makes it normal that we are not all good at everything, which is beautiful.
And I think that it is, I completely agree. Emotions are so important here. That anxiety that you feel when you see a big word, oh my God, I can't even begin to say that word. Then I'm not even going to attempt it. And that's where actually, phonics and morphology comes in there. Because if you can teach young children that, and I've been saying this for years, big words are made up of smaller words. That's not my own statement. That's a statement from a movie I watched about spelling, actually. But it's true. Big words are made up of smaller words. And if you can learn the linguistic roots of words, not all of them, just the basics. Or if there's a big word and you can't understand it, okay, what part of the word do you understand? It might be the end. It might be, the beginning part.
Yes.
Then you can start to break down the puzzle of the word, and that will help with that anxiety. Because, like you say, once that anxiety kicks in, you've already given up. You've convinced yourself that you can't attempt this problem. That word is a problem, and you can't go near it.
And you know what? When children come to us when they are 3, they don't have that.
Primary schools should start teaching morphology. I know it sounds like what is the 1960s? We're learning English grammar. No, morphology is the mathematical side of English, because it's the puzzle.
Absolutely right. And you know what happens is they come. We are gifted as teachers. We are gifted these young people, and it's the parents' most treasured gift. And we are gifted these children, and they come into our schools at 3 or 4 or 5, or in South Africa when you turn 7, the year you turn 7, we go to school. And until that day, you are the fastest in your house. You are the cleverest. You are the most amazing child your parent has at that age. You are just the most wonderful thing. You go to school and suddenly the message is you're not the fastest in the class. You're actually not that good at writing. Your drawing is not really that great. Oh, you can't sing. Please stop singing. And these are the messages that we give children from the age of 3. So just imagine by the time we get to 12 and 13, 14, 15, no wonder children don't want to come to school. It's not a nice place because it's the place where we tell them what they can't do.
Even grading, I sometimes purposely or on purpose don't give my students grades. And they want to know, I'm like, read the feedback first. Read where you went well and where you could have improved, and really digest that. We'll do the grades tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Because once they see a grade, that's it. They've already. That's the judgment, and that's, like you say, a grades are associated with anxiety. I look forward to the time, to the day where we go back to feedback only. We do away with grades. But the education system is such that it all goes up to university, doesn't it? Universities want grades, and that goes on to college, and that's just where we are as human beings. But sometimes as a classroom teacher, it can be helpful not just put those grades away. We'll deal with that in a while.
Those low risk assessments, those quizzes, those exit tickets, because that's when children show us what they know. So I used to teach GCSE psychology and GCSE maths, and the psychology was because I'm a psychologist that I was kind of how it works in school. And at the end of the paper, I would always have a blank sheet, and at the top I would say things I knew that Miss B didn't ask. And they would get extra credit for that. And they could write down anything that we covered that wasn't in the paper, but they studied or they know about or they remember. And they would get extra credit for it. Because that's when we cultivate a love for learning.
Yeah. And that, links into staff as well. When teachers feel valued, they stay. Why do teachers move? I've been here for 11 years and I've seen so many teachers move around. And I ask myself, why do teachers leave and why do teachers stay? And quite often teachers stay because they feel valued and they're given time and space to grow. Children too. Children, why do they like certain classes? Why do they like certain subjects and not other subjects? Because they're made to feel valued rather than being judged. Maybe another subject has too much of a focus on grades and assessment, and that's just full of anxiety. Whereas another subject might just be about growth and what, like you said, what have you learned? What can you do? And that also goes into the workplace as well, because Martin and I talked about how when you apply for a job, right? Imagine applying for a job and it tells you this is what you have to do, and it's quite demanding, right? How can you do this? And you look at it, you think, God, I can't do any of that. I can do this, but they're not asking for that. So children with special neurodiverse children. It might be helpful if the employment sector started asking for, like you say, what can you do? You want to apply, you want to work for a company, list for us what can you do and examples of it too. And, of course, site references as well. And then we can find a place appropriate for you in our company.
There are companies here in the UAE who are looking at things like that. So we've got a brilliant, it's called Siemens Energy. They're part of Siemens Technology, but they're called Siemens Energy. And that's exactly the approach they take. They say, so we need somebody front of house. And they put the job out and they say, this is a people of determination role, for instance. And then they look at all the people who apply and the people who come in for the interviews, and they say, what can you add to this? What do you bring? And I think that's the key. It's yes, we can train. And when I was head of school, I would always employ for attitude and personality, because skills I can teach you. Aslam, I can teach you how to teach maths. I can teach you how to teach English in primary school, not in secondary school, but in primary school. But I cannot teach you how to be a team player. I cannot teach you how to be kind. And I cannot teach you how to make a child feel like they belong. And that's what the teacher's job is.
It's a huge responsibility. It really, really is. I was doing this podcast conversation of a Hollywood actor. I haven't finished editing it yet. But he said, as actors, we get paid so much. But really, you guys are the ones that should be getting all of that money, because it's a huge responsibility. The role model, the role model element that you guys play, because it's not talked about much. It's more about teachers are there to teach subjects and the knowledge for the exams. But the role model element is huge, because you're that guiding person in a young person's life. Young people need role models, and you're in the parents aside, for that large portion of the day, you're the responsible adult in front of them. And you have to set those examples, be their role model, teach them those soft skills about life, not just about academic. But this is what I always say. I said, all teachers, we all have to now start looking into some element of coaching training, because we are coaches now. We are coaches. The movies that are made about teachers, Mrs. G and Coach Carter, what's the element they focus on? The coaching element, because that's the part that has the most impact. You're never going to think, oh, that teacher was brilliant, they got me an A. Have you ever heard a young person say that? No, that teacher was brilliant. That teacher believed in me. That teacher believed in me and showed that in the verbal and non-verbal communication. Like, they really invested in me. And and that's a huge part of the role of a teacher. Helping young people, because when they're adolescents, they have so many hormones flying around, and all the anxiety and worry, and the idea of self-worth kicks in, and teachers were there to help them manage that.
And I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read the book The Anxious Generation.
I've been recommended that. I haven't read it yet.
It's so brilliantly put in the book that actually we've created a world where anxiety and burnout is the norm. And teachers, if we go back to our original role, and the original role is exactly what you're saying, is coaching. There's a brilliant educator in America called Dr. Brad Johnson. And he wrote a quote the other day that says, from ABCs to PhDs, the teachers are the main characters, or the main role players. And that's the thing. I think sometimes people forget that engineers make bridges and doctors heal people, but teachers make all of those.
Talking about engineers and bridges and teachers and role models, one of my Qatari students, she was applying to do a degree, but she wasn't applying here. This is maybe 10 years ago now. She's applying, and she couldn't find an engineering course here in Qatar. And so she goes, I'm not gonna have it. So she applied to the UK, and all her friends said, what are you doing? Just do the regular route of of getting like a politics degree, and then you finish that degree and you get married and you settle down, and that's it, done. She said, no, she said, I would like to be an engineer, whether I was a boy or a girl. That's what I want to do. And she came to me and she goes, sir, can you write me a reference for university? I said, of course I'll write it. And I said, you know what, you go for it. Say no, don't say anything to the naysayers. Just say, well, thanks for your advice, I'm going to go for it. And she did. She went for it. She disappeared for 3-4 years. She came back and she sent me an email. She goes, sir, I just finished my degree. I said, brilliant. She goes, I'm not done yet. I want to apply for a master's. I want to do that here. I said, of course. I wrote a second reference for her. She did a master's. And just this August, she emailed me again. She goes, I'm applying for a PhD. And I said, of course. And I said, you know what? It was great to see that journey, and she's now doing her PhD, but she's also an engineer for Qatar Airways. She builds the aeroplanes. And look how that self-conviction, and all I did is just nurture it along, helped her surpass societal expectations. So with that, and I realized from looking at that journey, just the role that we play and the impact that we as educators can have. Telling someone you can do this and telling someone no, you shouldn't do that. That you shouldn't do that can go such a long way, and a young person they can have that in their brain for a very long time. Oh well, I was told I shouldn't do that.
And you know what the thing is research tells us that for every negative comment that a child receives, they need 5 positive comments to negate that negative comment. When a child has got special needs, or there's neurodiversity, or there are people, especially with a child like with ADHD symptoms or ADHD behaviors or traits, what happens is research tells us that they hear about 20,000 more negative comments in their schooling career than a normal child. So if you think about it, as for that child, they need about 100,000 more positive comments to actually fix the damage that those negative comments have done. It basically comes down in the school day to something like a negative comment every 4.6 minutes. So basically what we need to do and remember with student of determination and the anxiety piece part of that, but also the piece that says we are also more likely to take on the negative because we know we struggle. We're clever enough to know we're supposed to be able to do it, but we can't do it. So therefore, you must be right about me. And it's exactly that thing that where you said a child only needs one person outside of their direct immediate family to say, I think you can do it. Let me write that reference for you because I'll be in the cheer squad when you come over the line. And that's your job. And in inclusion, that is so incredibly important, not just with the teachers and the parents, but with our students as well. There are many families, and I'm sure you have many examples of this as well, over the 25, 26 years that I've been involved in education, where the children have beat the odds. And how dare we decide what a child can or can't do? It's not up to us.
Exactly. So what would you say then, Berna? What would you say are some of the, in your experience, what are some of the common misconceptions about diversity and inclusion that you've encountered in the educational system?
You know what? One of the things that is most common is that almost that err on the side of caution for children of determination, where we are more likely to say what they can't and what they're not able to do. Now, I was in a meeting the other day, and I'm just going to give you an example of this. I was in a meeting the other day, and with a group of parents who were talking about post 18. They've all got children in alternative pathways, so they're not following the GCSE or A level route. They are following a totally different program that's designed for them, but which means that they won't go to college or community college or university because they don't qualify, because they don't have that qualification. And we're sitting in this meeting, and the parents are talking about what opportunities can we create as a group of people to have these opportunities for our children, whether that is, skills-based, vocational training, what can we do? And there was a teacher that actually the head of inclusion she was in the meeting, and she kept on saying, but you must remember your child is not able to do this and this. And you must remember that and I was sitting there thinking, these parents know. They know. We know by the time our children are 15, 16, 17, 18, we know. But what we need and what all parents need is hope. So I always, I've got a very, very good friend, and he works for the IQM, the Inclusion Quality Mark. And he always says, you have to leave an outstretched hand. So at the end of the conversation, Kevin always says, make sure that you've got a hand stretched out that the parent or the teacher or the child can reach up to and grab, because in the end of the day, hope is the only thing that actually makes us see things through.
To be pessimistic gets you nowhere. It's just to give up. Then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But hope can break that chain, and it's only through examples. So Martin, like you say, is a great example. You're a great example. There's so many great examples all around the world that say, this is a person with a learning need, but look what they've achieved. Look what they've achieved, and have that. And let's today say farewell to that defeatist attitude, to that defeatist mentality, because it gets you nowhere. Let's today say, where can we go with this? what can we do and what can we achieve. Let's try to supersede our own expectations and others' expectations of us, because that all comes down to what? That feeling that the young person is filled with. You help the young person to feel hopeful and optimistic, then they're going to have a fantastic experience at school. Regardless of where they end up, regardless of where they end up working, it's all about what's the school experience we're giving that young person. And it has to be one of positivity.
Absolutely right. And belonging. It all goes back to the relationship and belonging, because when you feel part of a bigger picture, you have purpose. And purpose, we know from a lot of research that's been done on grit and values, that purpose is the one thing that keeps us going.
Yeah, exactly. So then what do you say then, Berna, when it comes to the future of neurodiversity and inclusion? How do you see the future of inclusion evolving in schools, not just GEM schools, but all around the world? And what role do you think technology will play in that transformation?
I think technology is going to be huge, because one thing that we know, the world was created by neurodivergent people, but not for us. So it's by us, but not for us. And I think the role of technology is going to make it easier for people with neurodiversities and other difficulties to actually adjust to the world as it is now. But the world as it is now, if you just look at the rising numbers now, and I know there's people who say, well, it's being overdiagnosed, and maybe there's a case to make for that. But actually, if you look at let me go back a bit. Alex Partridge wrote a book called Now It All Makes Sense. And he said a thing last week, was actually Neurodiversity Week internationally. And he did a talk at a school, and he said, when you look up the traits of ADHD, because he writes about ADHD, you'll see, we are distractible, we can't focus, we have all of these things that we struggle with. But let me tell you about the good things about us. We work at a pace that nobody else can match. We see things in a way that nobody else sees. We are creative in our solutions. We design things. We see problems in a way that twists the problem around and actually says, but let's start here. And we start unraveling things in ways that other people don't always see, because our thinking is not linear. And actually, if we go from the strength approach that we spoke about, if you look at the role that technology and AI is playing, AI works like that.
AI isn't judgmental. That's what I like about it. It doesn't have that human judgment. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. Humans often we're quite judgmental. We've already made up our mind, because our judgments are, as psychology, that you'll know that it's informed by our histories, our pasts. As AI is like, no, it does away with all of that.
Yes, and if you think about it, being South African and speaking with a very heavy Afrikaans accent, people often assume, I'm just a farm girl from South Africa, which is great. It works in my favor, because it gives me the time to actually see what they say. But, we are judgmental to a degree where we even look at people, what they look like, what they're wearing, what they eat, what they order in a restaurant, the books we read. It's all based on judgment. And actually, if we look at the strength approach, and as you say, AI or technology doesn't make a judgment call. But what it does is it levels the playing field. So if you think about it, people with neurodiversity will have the edge moving forward, because we'll all have the same platform, but the platform gets us more than they get neurotypical people. And I think it's going to change the game for a lot of people, especially the way that schools are going to work, because we're going to do a lot more in terms of gamification, reward and punishment, in terms of dopamine levels. And as our understanding of the human brain and neuroplasticity changes, AI and technology will become more like that. So we will start using all of those things we now know about the brain, incorporate it into our school system through AI, which will mean that I suspect that people with neurodiversity might have a slight edge in 10, 15 years' time.
Benjamin Zephaniah says that we are the architects, and he goes, we've got, what did he say? Young and he says to his dyslexic readers, he says, young and dyslexic, you've got it going on. You're the ones that have that, like you say, that edge.
Yes.
And I think technology will, because what we learn about neurodiversity, neuroplasticity, we can feed it into AI to help neurodiverse people. And what AI will do, it will put aside the judgment and it will just grow and learn in relation to how it can help neurodivergent people.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think the world is going to be an exciting place because it will actually, for the first time, be fair, if that makes sense.
What advice then do you have, Berna? What advice do you have for other educational institutions? You know, GEMS is doing a great job, and there's so many things that people listening to this can take. What advice would you say? What takeaways would you have for leaders who are just starting to put a focus and are starting to prioritize inclusion? What are some of the steps that they can take to become more inclusive?
I think the first step is to spend time with people of diversity. Because when you give other people a voice, people of diversity, of neurodiversity, and all other diversities should be part of the conversation. The biggest mistake a school leader can make is to think they know. And, we often do that as adults. We decide on behalf of children. But have a conversation with your staff. Have a conversation with people with neurodiversity. Have a conversation about what works for them. The best question you can ever ask a child or a person with neurodiversity is, which is your preferred method? How does your brain work? So I would always start with conversations. I am very verbal, so conversation is my thing. But then also learn as much as you can. And the other thing is also, please investigate your unconscious biases. Because we all grow up with these ideas of this is how things should be, and the world doesn't work like that. Maybe if you grew up in a specific place and you stayed there your whole life and you never had any other experiences, maybe that setting is still the same. But in an international setting and international schools, the way inclusion and the way the world works now is you cannot sit in a position of expertise. None of us have that. Learn. Make sure that you are never the smartest person in the room.
Learn and I like that, learn and unlearn as well.
Absolutely. And make sure you know, because we all have them. We all have unconscious biases. So make sure you know them. The next thing is, as I would always say, is make sure that you've got policies and procedures in place to protect your students of determination or your students of special needs. Because what often happens is, Dr. Ross Green writes, it's again a brilliant book called Lost at School. And it's about the behavior piece that we're currently seeing all over the world. And in the book, he says the problem is not the learning need. The problem is not the neurodiversity. The problem is not the special need. The problem is the fact that the needs aren't being met. And the moment the needs aren't being met, the behavior starts. And what we often see then is, if you look at the UK's exclusion rate, and I'm not having a go at the UK, but if you look at the exclusion rate based on behaviors that are linked to special needs because the support's not there. So make sure that you have the right policies and procedures in place. And then again, make sure that you reach out to people. And you know what? There's very, very rarely where you reach out to people in inclusion where they say, no, we don't want to help you. If somebody reaches out to me, I will always, 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 always do my best to help.
Experts are out there, and part of the reason I do this podcast is that I try to connect people. So, if someone's in the UK and they want some training and, reach out to Berna. She's right here. You've also got Beyond Inclusion. It's a company very recently formed with Sandra Tibbles, Victoria Rayner, and Martin Bloomfield. I also did a podcast with a man called Jonathan Newport. And Jonathan Newport is a behavior he doesn't like the word expert, but he's been doing behavior for so long. And he said to me in his podcast discussion that when a child misbehaves, it's because they're trying to say something. It's a form of communication, and it's not that the child wants to be malicious most of the time, or they just want to cause disruption. They perhaps don't understand something, that there's a learning need or a behavioral need that's not being met. And because it's not being met, they're going to react like that. So if you can come down to determining, and this is where teachers have to work together. If teachers share the teaching of this child, it's better for them to come together. Right, let's try and solve the puzzle. Why is this child misbehaving for? What are they trying to say through their misbehavior? And so the experts are there, and educators. I spoke to a teacher the other day, and they said, "Oh, the UK, the behavior is so bad." And I just think it's part of that may be down to the fact that they're so busy with grades and inspections and so on that they haven't just taken a breather to say, okay, what are our students needs, and how are we not meeting them? What's gone wrong here?
What's gone wrong? And I think a big part of that is talking to the children and saying, where are we? Where are you? What's going on in your life? Because there's less and less of those conversations going on at the moment. I've got two boys who are at university, and one of the things I love about the university where they're at is they each have a personal tutor that just checks in. That have nothing to do with their academics. They've got nothing to do with the fact that they missed
That's
class.
their coach.
Absolutely. It's literally just, and how are you today? And when last did you have that conversation with a colleague and you just stopped everything and just said, I'm here to listen, how are you today? And I think as not only with children, but with adults around us, I think we need to slow down and just sometimes say, hey, how are you doing?
Well-being isn't something that we do, it's something that's ongoing as well, and it can just be a conversation.
Absolutely agree. And you know what? This is the beauty of these podcasts that you do, because actually what you're doing is that you're exposing these issues, and people listening to this have a link to go to, or have a person to go to, or somebody that they can ask advice. And the beauty of all of this is, as a community, we are stronger together.